We're very excited about tonight's panel. It was born out of discussions that Britt and I had. She is a member of the Financial Writers Association and our logistics person for the Roundtable. And when Silicon Valley blew up, Silicon Valley Bank, we were talking about the dissemination of data. Not necessarily information, but data, how fast things travel, especially bad news. And, a run on a bank was a good example of how things could be misinterpreted, miscommunicated, and so forth. So we decided time to have this panel to discuss the interaction between the press and the buy side, meaning hedge funds, venture capital, other money managers, and such. So we're excited to welcome our panelists, and I'll start with Maneet Ahuja. I got that right. She's a senior editor and founder, editor-at-large of ICONOCLAST at Forbes. And they'll tell you a little bit about themselves once they get started. And then Antoine Gara is the U.S. and private and institutional capital correspondent at the Financial Times. Then we have Sarah Tomolonious, who's a longtime Roundtable member and a partner and head of investor relations at M13, which is an early-stage consumer tech venture capital firm. And she'll tell you a little bit more about that. And then our moderator, Amanda Cantrell, and she's an award-winning financial journalist who has focused on hedge funds and institutional asset management for the majority of her 20-year career. She currently runs U.S. investment coverage at Bloomberg. And before that, she was a finance features editor at Insider and previously spent 15 years as an institutional investor. And she's also done work as a CNN reporter for its online business verticals. So I'm going to hand it over to Amanda, and at the end she'll hand it back to me. I have some announcements for our members and for our guests. So without any further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Amanda. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. I think, I'd like to go ahead and jump right in. So, if you each want to, preface your answer with a, brief description of what you do day to day on this first question, that would be great. So Sarah, I'm going to put you in the hot seat right away. BJ mentioned SVB, and this is obviously what inspired this event. We all know that private investment assets have swelled to new highs in recent years, and as a result, so has the attention and scrutiny paid to alternative investment firms. And so we want to talk about the relationship between alternative investment firms, private investment firms, and the journalists who cover them. How it's changed, how it could be better, what's going right so far, and what not to do when a reporter calls with a negative story that turns out to be accurate. Sarah, I'm actually going to throw that situation at you. Let's say you're sitting at your desk, you get a call from a reporter who says they know your firm is in trouble. And to be clear, I'm speaking hypothetically here. And it turns out that the information they have is good. How should someone in your role manage a situation like that?
Well, first of all, thank you everyone for being here. I sat at the edge because I'm the sole GP on this panel, so if I need to quickly, skedaddle, I'll be able to do so. Just as BJ said, M13, we're a venture capital firm. We invest in the enabling technologies that power the future of work, commerce, money, and health. We invest in marketplaces, SaaS, software, picks and shovels. I would say a couple of things. One, I think, and this is true kind of sort of writ large about how I think about communications. First of all, if your first entree with that particular reporter, like if you haven't developed the relationships beforehand, you're probably in a tight spot anyway. I mean, I think about the relationship between media and investment managers, alternative investment managers, all managers, should be symbiotic. There are things that we get from those relationships as managers, certainly the ability to broadcast our brand and differentiation and expertise, and then reporters, similarly need content as well. I was thinking about sort of like the evolution and how I would have treated this, a call from a reporter that maybe I had not known of before 10 or 15 years ago. You probably would have said no comment. I would have said no comment because Simpson or K&E or whoever was our, external counsel had given us a list that said basically your answer is no comment, end of story. I don't think that, I don't think it's possible to do that anymore. And in fact, when I read stories and I see no comment, I think, oof, like what are they hiding? I think there are a couple of ways to manage it. First, I guess it's helpful to contextualize it. I mean, is this, what kind of crisis is this? Is it fundraising? Is it sort of an SEC violation? Is it some sort of untoward thing that the CEO did? I mean, I think that that matters. There are a lot of ways you can address things, as you in the room know probably better than I, off the record or on background. I certainly think that having a reporter, I mean, one of the things I would do is say, can you email me, tell me what your deadline is, because especially in New York, I think it's only one party has to consent to recording, right? So if you pick up the phone, you could inadvertently say something that maybe is not as clear or as sculpted as you want it to be. But those are generally how I think about things. The other thing is, if you get to that crisis point and you haven't thought about it and it really is true, then you're also doing something wrong. I mean, I exist with, I always say is in IR, I mean, I have my CFO on one side and I have my my GC on the other side. Sitting right next to them is the external counsel, and then over here is the PR person. So we should have long before figured out a strategy around, I mean, we shouldn't be caught unawares. And so hopefully we would have come to a consensus together on, what we want to put out there, how we want to address it. So.
Great. A lot of things in there I want to come back to. But Antoine, I noticed you were nodding your head when Sarah was discussing, having, the need to have thought about it before and how it might be a problem if you haven't, if the internal team hasn't. And it made me think of the situation with the regional banking crisis, because, it seemed like you were in a situation where, as you mentioned on a prep call that we had prior to this event, there was balance sheet information that was kind of hiding in plain sight. And yet, as journalists, when, we're reporting on the situation, it was, extremely important for us to get the story right, which it always is, but especially so at a time when, people are potentially, concerned about, a wrong headline or even a misleading headline causing a bank run, for example. So, would love to hear your thoughts on kind of, what journalists should do when they are A, reporting on a crisis situation like that, and B, confronting a firm that it seems like hasn't really thought about the situation before.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. And Antoine Gara from the Financial Times, I cover private capital, and the FT obviously has done a lot of reporting on the regional banking crisis, including Silicon Valley Bank, highlighting kind of some of the issues on their balance sheet in February before the crisis really metastasized. But I think like in that situation, when people sort of replay it now and people have diagnosed it, again, a lot of people have said that it was hiding in plain sight, and if you go back and listen to the earnings calls, they were analysts who were sort of asking about different issues, and it kind of continued to sort of become more and more important over time. I think everyone was very surprised by just how quickly everything played out, and I think the notion that you could have people pull $42 billion from a bank in 6 hours or 8 hours, and I think there was an amazing stat in the postmortem recently where I guess there was like $1 million being pulled every minute or something like that. So, I think what's been interesting is how much that crisis has sort of made everyone realize how quickly information can cause things to move. That bank was also in a lot of our reporting very much an outlier, and then kind of a crisis has ensued that's much more confidence based and much less based on fundamentals, which is also kind of interesting. And I know that I think a lot of reporters were very concerned about how do we sort of push back against causing a bank run or something of that nature, but also informing the public of what was going on, because that is also the media's job, is to give a clear, unvarnished explanation of what's going on. So you sort of can't take the approach that you can't just sort of not cover things as well. Actually, what I was nodding my head on Sarah's answer was when there's an issue, like firms that have prepared for it, and then someone calls or it comes up on a shareholder call, or however it comes out, it does make sense to have prepared for it. And if a firm is not prepared for it, that's a real sort of either the issue was hidden and they just didn't know about it, or there was just some sort of hope that no one would ever find out, which would seem somewhat misleading. Or firms have shareholders or private investors, they have constituents, and so part of their job in managing a company is to make sure that they're prepared to explain what's going on. So I thought that was a really good answer, that you have to, if there are personnel issues or if there's financial issues, you kind of have to proactively figure out what your message is going to be. I was actually just thinking recently of a private capital firm where there's a lot of thought about inflows and outflows and money moving in and out of certain funds. And so what they had done, in a recent earnings call, was really sort of add extra disclosure so that the journalists and the investors, because it was a public firm, they could really understand much more specifically what each inflow and outflow was, and then they wouldn't jump to broad conclusions based on a number that actually had maybe 5 or 6 components to it. So I think that that's really important.
How did SVB respond to FT?
We had a lot of communication, prior to their collapse, and then what was actually interesting was technically the FDIC owned the firm after their collapse, and it was very hard actually to reach, people afterwards, because the FDIC was handling their communications, which was really unique and really challenging, because it was still a very competitive news environment where you sort of had to publish, but you also had to give people the chance to comment. But it was, some of the top leadership had been sort of, basically relieved of their duty essentially through the whole, that whole receivership. And so that was actually really interesting.
Can I just give props to the FT, because there was a wonderful, it was like a dirge for SVB from, I think, Michael Moritz, the Sequoia.
Oh yeah, that's
yeah.
right.
And it was, if you haven't read it, I would suggest you go to FT and read it. It was really about, I think sometimes we're probably going to talk about things today like a little bit in the abstract, but then we forget the fundamental, the real sort of loss of SVB and the role it played for 4 decades in supporting a lot of founders and companies that we know well today that wouldn't have otherwise. There wasn't other sort of banking infrastructure to enable that. So, but it humanized, I think, what had been kind of like, sort of a car crash. And it really, it brought home the longer term ramifications of the loss of SVB.
So Maneet, I wanted to ask you, in your view, what should companies or firms not do? Like, what is a way, what should you not do when you are dealing with a call from a reporter, either about a situation as serious as SVB or, something like, a fund's performance was terrible for the month and you happen to get their numbers. Like, what are the do's and don'ts in your view of handling that?
Another great question, and just kind of launching off of the great context and feedback from Sarah and Antoine with an example on do's and don'ts. It kind of all coalesces together. So I had a situation where I did have an existing relationship with the IR person at a fund, and it was related to a recent cover story I had done where it was a profile on an individual in the alternative space, and it was just one tiny section of the story was rehashing GameStop as it relates to the fund and their involvement. And the relationship with the IR person at the counterpart, Robinhood, without going into any other specifics. And I started in a very, because we did have an existing relationship, I proactively reached out because there was still a lot of confusion when the story was being written about payment for order flow, even though we were 1 year past, and the party in the cover story had been cleared of wrongdoing as it relates to that. And I was surprised because I had met that individual in journalism school, and the relationship, instead of being a very easy conversation that could have gotten us from point A to B very quickly, wound up in this whole big circle, culminating in threats and just things that were unnecessary, or this is not, phrases like this is not what we learned in journalism school. And so that was particularly disappointing because we were pointing to facts and FINRA violations, and it was really just a paragraph, 2 paragraphs in a 4,000 plus word story. But the combativeness made the situation, sometimes when people, things then get escalated to your editor, for whatever, how you handle things is important. And so, whereas there could have been a little bit more collaboration, I felt it was above my head and the door felt shut, partially in some small way, because of how the interaction was from the beginning.
Right.
The facts didn't change, but the way it was handled, changed. And so in terms of do's and don'ts, I totally agree. I think, no comment shuts the door really early when, on the other hand, I used it as an opportunity to educate myself about market making and something that I really didn't fully understand, and then there was a lot of confusion about, and used external third-party sources to back up claims for both sides. And so it ended up being productive in the end because I learned a lot, but I could have easily just gotten the information from that source, and the corrections that were demanded were denied.
Right.
So I'm not sure if that's helpful.
No, it definitely is, and I can absolutely co-sign conversations that were very painful in the moment, but ended up being productive in the long run. I can also co-sign that being combative from the word go, which is because I've covered the same industry for so long, it's not a situation that I've encountered that much anymore, but it does happen from time to time, and it's just not a good way to start the conversation with someone. You can express your concerns and your displeasure, but I think coming in hot is tends to be counterproductive.
The entourage era of PR is over. One of the PR said to me, but the other thing is it's a fallacy that things are always going well. now I've learned this, but everything's always going to be going up and to the right. Like, of course you're going to have, issues, troubles, challenges, problems. I mean, I think as we talked about, these are partnerships, right? And so I don't think, unless there's, someone's a sociopath and there's a vendetta against you, which is, probably not going to be the reality. You're working together to make sure the information is accurate, right? And there are some things, sometimes crap happens and you're gonna have to wade through that. And I think, to your points, how you behave when those things, that's really telling of, the quality of person and firm and culture and those things. So.
Well, just to Maneet's point, I guess, her story was on the, in part on the whole Robin Hood wave of financial markets, which I think, even the most learned and skilled financial practitioners really sort of were throwing their hands up in the air, during that year. And since this is an alts roundtable, I mean, private assets and, in that anecdote, private trading, for very high frequency, algorithmic way, it's all very private. And so, journalists will probably, by definition of the markets being private, have limited information. And so their information will probably be correct in some regards, especially if it's a very, high standard publication and a high quality reporter. But that's not necessarily, even if they're, honest and skilled and well sourced, they still may not have the complete information or the broader context around, one or two or three pieces of information. And so I think with private market firms, a lot of that context is really important. And actually most good journalists want that context because it'll make the story better, it'll make the story more accurate. And, I always just basically think there, especially on private stories, there's maybe 100 or 1,000 people who really know what's going on in the story or the firm I'm writing about, and it, the story has to hold water to those people first and foremost. And so if you've incorrectly assembled your information, your readers will not sort of find your reporting credible in the future if it doesn't have the right context. And so I think that's another huge incentive to figure out ways to engage with reporters. And I mean, especially in a time like this where, there's a lot of sort of not great things happening or not great things sort of in the works. And, there could be certain firms where, there's a deal that's not going to reflect well on them, but it may not just be their issue, it may be a broad market issue. And so, there's certain things of context that I think can really be very valuable for stories.
And to your point, kind of going back to that one specific example, and then also a point that you had earlier made, in the extensive reporting for that story, there was like the Justice Department angle, but then there were like civil lawsuits that were filed that were obviously biased, and with limited information, it's easy to fall into being directed to lawsuits and the wording being characterized, like unless you have somebody on the other side that is contextualizing and explaining from both angles, obviously like there is stuff that technically like is a source that is out there. It's easy to fall into those pitfalls. And so in an effort to collectively work on that reporting, that was like a ship that needed to be turned around, where it was a wasted opportunity, again, to not have the direct channel to clear up things that were somewhat biased, because it was still a legal document. So as the reporter, I was pointed to that, and so that's just another situation where if there had been more of an open channel of communication, it just could have been an easier process.
Right, because you're dealing with the information that you have.
Right. And I'm like, tell me, this doesn't feel 100% right, but this is what I have. So help me connect the dots accurately, was kind of the approach. And then to your point about the one party state, I was on the other end where I had to ask as a reporter, am I being recorded? And so, and it is what it is. So it goes both ways.
Absolutely. Sarah, I'd like to kind of turn around the what not to do question for you. What is an experience you've had with a journalist that you found frustrating and you felt could have gone better, and why?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. I mean, the one that came up sort of like top of mind was not really directly with a journalist, but I was at a former firm. We were fundraising, and somehow an article came out. We had filed non-general solicitation. So there was an article, and it said that we were raising a fund. And it was, it wasn't, the source wasn't named, and we didn't know if someone in the firm had said something. And so basically what happened was we were waiting on pins and needles for a couple weeks to figure out if we were going to have a stay on fundraising, and it was around 2010, so it was not an easy fundraising environment. I would say, I think 10 years ago there were a lot of reporters who were just scouring, Form Ds and 506Cs and maybe Bs and things like that. I don't know. You guys tell me if that happens so much anymore. But I think a learning was there's typically 15 days of silence after you file those, and so to Antoine's point, to both of your points, but prepare, right? Like if you can control as much as you can control. Before things, maybe that's you put something out on social or etc. That just sort of came top of mind, and maybe I don't know if it could have been prevented. But another thing that we do, that I've always done, again working hand in hand with the council, is to the extent that we're about to fundraise, we make sure that there is a firm-wide missive that goes out that says, these are the things you cannot say, like the word fund or fundraise, and just make sure you don't say those things. But I think getting everyone on the same page, and getting everyone at the firm or the company, the manager, on the same page is helpful to sort of mitigate and helpful to have like cohesive messaging, right? Otherwise you might have rogue people that don't mean to be rogue, they just are not kind of in the know. And so making sure, it's probably more of a cultural thing, just making sure that there's good internal communication, I think is the hallmark of having good external communication.
And one of the topics of discussion that was advertised in the literature for this event was the ways that things have changed, the ways that the relationships have changed. We are now, unlike when I was starting out in journalism, the phrase fake news had not taken hold in the consciousness yet. So I wanted to, for Antoine and Maneet, I'd love if you guys could share your perspective on what it's like to work in that environment. Do you feel like people have become more emboldened to lie to you? Do you think it's just a lot of noise? How do you respond to that?
Well, I think, I don't know, maybe I'm talking our book as business journalists a bit too much, but we deal with like numbers and things that are somewhat dispositive facts. Like you can sort of prove a lot of things, and so I felt like somewhat been insulated from the the broader sort of mushroom cloud that's gone on with our public discourse. And so you can sort of counteract these sort of fake news things by just pointing to facts that are very hard to dispute. I think there are a lot of people who will sort of accuse different reporters of having an agenda, and I guess that falls in the spectrum of fake news. But sometimes that strikes me as a bit unfair. Like, the media is not necessarily like the marketing arm of any specific firm, and the media is allowed to write negative stories, and especially if they're factual, and it's not necessarily a reflection of some bias or some hatred of a subject or an industry or something like that. But I think that that in this environment of kind of fake news, you do get it seems like more complaints about sort of agenda and things of that nature. But the reality is, the business of news is, there's something new, and so, often that is, things that are somewhat, negative, or things that, the person, an individual or a firm or a subject or what have you would rather not be in the public domain.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So you don't think advertisers, for example, have any influence on media stories and
No,
publications?
absolutely not.
Not at all.
Yeah, I mean,
Subject.
the only time I ever talk to the ad department is, at our softball games. So, technically, they're supposed to be like the good hitters, because we're a bunch of, nerds that read filings all day and what have you. So, but no, I mean, I think that's, for instance, that would strike me as kind of a ridiculous claim. Like, you have people who are extremely skilled, who have, taken jobs that are pretty stressful and, not super great on the remuneration front. And to think that they would just, then just sit there scratching, some guy in the ad department's back would be kind of ridiculous.
I'm not accusing anybody sitting at the table
Yeah.
or anybody specifically, but I think there have been plenty of instances of news reporting being colored by financial sponsorships. I mean, look at Pfizer, for example. They sponsor everything from Jeopardy to all sorts of stuff. And there have been accusations that it's affected news coverage of things like COVID policy and stuff like that. We throw a lot of money around.
COVID policy was above my pay grade.
I know we're talking financial, but I'm just saying.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I would back up what Antoine's saying there. I unfortunately do get asked to speak to sponsors or potential advertisers because alongside reporting, I'm building a business, which is a big undertaking in an events business, but purely, like, even on the live journalism front, there is zero guarantee. We don't pay to play for speaking slots unless, like, there's no positioning of this panel is being built for them. They don't get final say so, and then especially no interaction on any type of reporting. But I think that's what you have seen with specific avenues for news organizations where it's very clearly delineated. For Forbes, we have brand voice, and that's a sponsorship package that essentially looks like it's a contributor op-ed post. And so that kind of is an option that is very clear that it's not directly reported, where they're basically writing their own blog post. Other organizations have their own way of doing it, but I, on the print side and on the TV side prior to that, have never had any conversation where it's like, this advertiser wants X or Y, so let's try to do a story according to that. That's actually, at least at Forbes, it's a completely different department that is like sponsored journalism that is just there as like logistical support to help them write their own, to just help them publish their own op-eds. So.
Question?
Yeah.
This is to everybody. I was wondering to what extent you feel that CEOs of the companies you cover, or the funds, the heads of the funds, understand the need to contextualize, information for the reporter, instead of saying no comment, because you still think that the instinct of a lot of CEOs and heads of funds is because know the media well would say no comment, want to say no comment until they're educated. Your thoughts?
I mean, in my experience, there's like especially in private markets, there's just like an extraordinary spectrum. I mean, there are some firms that just, feel no interest whatsoever to engage with the media, and, doing fine on their own, and you know, life's great, and so they don't feel the need to be out there, and they you know, feel their constituents are not really the media. And then there are other people who, you know, are extremely engaging in the media and will, you know, make a very good effort to make their people accessible to reporters, make their leadership accessible, and so it's really, I would say, an amazing spectrum, especially in private assets. Like, you just can't. There's no one size fits all thing, and you would be shocked at the different approaches that people
It seems to
have.
me to argue then that the one that's more open would do best in the SVB kind of a crisis, where so many companies
Yeah, I
says,
think
I know
that-
the company's going under, or I got a really negative story.
That has to be part of the thought process, right? The more familiar you are, the more people know your business, the less they'll draw their own conclusions, you know, based on limited information. And then there's some people who probably think, well, my business is fine, and it's, you know, it's private, and that's the way it's going to be. So
I definitely second that. I mean, I'm thinking even like 10 to 15 years ago, you might find an asset manager that just had a landing page and a login and nothing more. I very rarely see that. I mean, I don't remember seeing that recently at all. And I would say, I mean, I was mostly sort of cut my teeth in mid-market and buyout. It was decidedly different than when I came to venture, where brand is the single most important, you know, thing in the asset class. And so we have a full brand and comms team that's, you know, that's built out with, you know, people that are the partner of brand and comms has 25 plus years experience, you know, working through many different crises for companies and people and things like that. I would guess that given another sort of 5 or 10 years, you won't be able to get away with, even if you feel like, oh, I have these things, you know, all handled, and we don't have a ton of investors, and we make these, you know, very special sort of specific types of investments, that you can't get away with just having a landing page with nothing more than your name. I think you really do have to cultivate relationships, because you're doing it anyway yourself, largely through social media. I mean, even if you don't have, you know, a huge presence, if you want to attract talent, you're going to probably have a Twitter feed, whether you do it or not, or there's something on LinkedIn, or whatever way you try to engage with. I think when you're trying to, you know, garner the best, you know, new employees and sort of next generation, you're just going to have to engage that way. You can't be silent anymore.
actually, you know, to Sarah's point, I used to write for Forbes magazine before I joined the FD, and would do a lot of the financial features, and you know, a key role of that job was landing like a few very big stories, you know, every year, and a lot of times it would be the firms that had never really engaged in the press, and sometimes, you know, as those stories could take years to come to fruition, but you know, part of my argument in furthering those stories was you're too big, and you have too many relationships with constituencies all over the world, and you know, potential, you know, you're too big to sort of be a black box, and then you know, that was a winning argument sometimes, and I think that it was really interesting when you saw firms, you sort of take that plunge and decide, okay, wow, we have so many constituencies, we should probably be in the media where we sort of have a little bit of control over, you know, what's written about us if we're engaging with the media.
Right, they're learning that, you know, when you get to a certain size, people are going to write about you whether you want them to or not. So you might as well make sure that they're getting it right.
And I mean, there are like a couple of investment banks from the crisis era who sort of, you know, were famous for not engaging with the media, and the media created narratives about them that didn't really work out well. So.
And as a launching off point for that, because now I have partially, that's my role is to try to do that at Forbes. I think, you know, it's interesting. Obviously, there's more momentum behind trying to participate after a record year for the firm or a huge milestone. But there's definitely a really good argument to be had where maybe it was a down year, but that track record is still there over that 10, 20-year period. Don't shut down the conversation. I mean, these stories have taken years to get to this point, and it'll be longer as we continue down that road. I would not shut down communication points just because there was a bad quarter or even a bad year. Because I think that there's a long-term story of the firm, and there's a long-term momentum, that story that's being built, and so I think that I've seen it work out really well. I recently just did a cover story for the Money issue, and this is not alts, it's on Ariel Investments and their 40-year investment track record, and it made sense for the firm, but it was after a down 16% year. But when you look over their investment horizon, they outperformed in each of the previous 3 or 4 crises, way outperformed in like the 30s. And so, I think that's one of the best stories that I've done. And it wasn't this elusive hedge fund, but it was just a very good combination of personal story, investment track record, more of that value investing approach. And I can't tell you how many folks, even in the alternative space or across industries, reached out because of that story, which frankly I didn't expect.
I would also say that you talked about constituents. I mean, one of the stakeholders that clearly is like invisible behind us are the investors. And investors are demanding accountability, and they want, it's the same as we were talking about, they want their managers to put out there, I mean, we don't want to go down the ESG or sort of sustainability rabbit hole because that's gotten different kind of press over the past couple of years. But I do think that the sort of earlier comment that you can no longer say no comment, I think you can no longer sort of be that black box, and I think investors are demanding that. Otherwise, it does seem like you're equivocating or hiding something, or not being not being open and transparent enough, which then I guess maybe that's the whole fake news feels like you're hiding something.
Yeah, I've got a question.
Yeah.
So, given that like a lot of funds, and you guys have mentioned like a lot of funds are like black boxes, like aside from like someone like going out to you and saying, "Hey, we want to tell you this story," like where do you guys actually come up with like ideas for stories? Because like there are some regulatory filings that you can see, and limited information on websites, and the fact that most alternative investment funds are not going to, they can't like fundraise amongst like the general retail public and stuff, and so it's very limited as to what they share. Like, do you go and look at like some of the data providers and see what information is posted there? Like, how are you guys doing? Like, what do you guys, like, what's your general process to find new stories other than when someone actually contacts you directly?
I mean, it's like everything. It's data providers. It's, when you have conversations with bankers or other investors or, executives, you always do throw out like, who should we be writing about? What aren't we covering? In private equity, obviously when firms do deals, right? Sometimes there are firms that all of a sudden will do like extraordinarily large M&A, and you say, wait a minute, I've never heard about this firm in my entire life, and so that's like automatically almost going to be a great story if you can figure it out on your own, or you can get access or what have you. And so I think reporters are really creative about figuring out like people or firms they would want to cover. In the hedge fund community, I think there are a lot of firms that still kind of basically are fairly secret. I think mostly generally in private equity people engage, but I think, I guess, partially by hazard of the industry and the fact that no arbitrage really stays around forever, there are a lot of hedge funds that sort of, there are media who are sort of banging down their doors for many years or decades, but won't really engage for their own reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that. I would say, you know, having been in, sorry, having been covering the space also, you know, in the 15 year range mark, like you do develop your core group of traders or sources, and for me, like short sellers are always a really good source, especially for interesting news stories. And obviously, like everybody has a perspective on the markets in a specific position, so I mean that's one. And then also, like, I think about it as, you know, 2 to 3 pillars when I'm thinking about a feature story. It's the personal story, like how dynamic this person is, their personal rise to power, so to speak, who the figurehead is, or if there's more than one, what the conflict is, and then like the influence of the institution or the firm that they've built, and the track record or how that's progressed over a long period of time, and then also like then the current state of the world and the markets and why this story matters now. So I mean, that at a high level is kind of what I'm looking for, is that trifecta for what I think can provide a compelling story.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. Like part of like whether, like even if someone were to want, you know, the media to write about them, they have to think about sort of what they're doing that's new or newsworthy or compelling, you know, and there are many different ways that they can get like their story above the bar. Like sometimes it is just the sheer size or something, that's easy. But then sometimes, you know, actually some of the more interesting stories in private markets are like these super niche strategies where, you know, it's sort of interesting by nature of how niche it is and how specific it is. And so like, you know, you've seen, you know, a lot of, you know, like private equity buying car washes or veterinary
You learned
clinics.
a lot about SPACs when they were just
Yeah, exactly.
coming out
Yeah,
and being
so
super hot.
so I think people also, if they want their story told, they have to be sort of creative in thinking about, you know, how can you know our story fit into something that will stand out as unique, and we're not just, you know, the next person who's just set up shop and trying to, you know, sort of have a magnet that catches a few dollars and you know, coming our way and make a good living off it.
One question I'd love to ask each of you is about the concept of trust, because, you know, one way that story ideas can emanate is from the firms themselves. If they have a really good relationship with a specific reporter or group of reporters, then, you know, or a news outlet, then, you know, maybe they have good news or bad news, they turn to the reporter they trust first because they know it's going to get out, so they, you know, kind of talk to someone they've worked with before. How do you, for Antoine and Maneet, how do you build trust with the firms that you cover? And Sarah, how do you build trust with the reporters that call you?
I think building trust as a first stop is obviously the quality of the work and time and attention that you put from that first interaction, and just making it clear that you're listening, that you're doing your research, that it is, so as a first step, I would say your work speaks for itself if you don't already have an existing relationship. And then in situations where maybe they don't know you, but they're a friend of the source that you had just done a story about. So kind of some source that can maybe vouch for you if it's harder to get into the room. Another first step is developing a relationship with the PR firm that deals with them and cultivating a relationship there, but coming at it from a couple different angles. I mean, I'm kind of answering the question a different way, but also looking at, there's a really tough source. what their board appointments are. And then so if there's a way in through a side door, through a board appointment or a philanthropic event, somewhere where you can observe them, where they're not necessarily expecting press to be, has sometimes worked for me in the past. And I think that's like a good starting point. And then I think it's just showing that you're ready to listen. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling a little bit. Antoine, what are you?
Well, I think also like the media function is, you're there to receive incoming questions from the press, and so there's sort of like a natural cadence to engaging with the press, especially if like you're a very active firm or a very large firm, and so for some really good beat reporters, they're really in contact with firms almost on a regular basis, affirming different pieces of information, many times a week. And so if that sort of in sort of times of peace or just general kind of calm, if that's a good two-way form of communication, that cadence can be really helpful then if something a more volatile environment comes out or there are more surprises, because you've sort of built up conveying information and affirming information and building sort of trust. And so then like if let's say there's a really crazy time and a reporter has a piece of information that you really truly feel is wrong, and you sort of say that because let's say the last 10 times there's been a fair sharing of information and so on, that'll actually be valuable, all that prior communication that you've had, because there is sort of just a natural compounding of trust. But then of course if you steer people or lie or something, you obviously would just undo that almost immediately.
Sarah?
Yeah, that's perfect, because I had written down be honest.
Oh, yeah.
So, I always say to our LPs, and I think I just generally view relationships like this, but trust and transparency are the hallmarks of a good, they're foundational components to good partnerships. And then if you wrap that in good communication, those are the building blocks for really, really long-term, sort of enduring synergistic partnerships. But as you were saying, I think these are not, they're not relationships in isolation. When I think about building relationships with reporters, it's very often through, the PR people who have had gone to business school, or journalism school, or wherever, have honed those relationships. The other thing is, I also think about choosing the particular publications. If I see a great piece or great articles, more inclined to want to think about how do we develop inroads. And again, it's not necessarily one-to-one, but it's figuring other people within our network that we can connect in to and sort of tighten the relationship. And then also respecting that it feels like in the media people move around a little bit more. So I think it is, it's not like you're going to have a relationship with one person at Forbes for the next 10 years. Mm-hmm. That person might move to FT or wherever. So.
Yeah, and on the being honest front, 100%. And I always veer towards under promise, over deliver, but actually in reporting, like I don't ever promise because it's not appropriate for me to promise anything. And so that is a part of a trusting relationship, is I try to make it extremely clear that we're moving, if it's a feature and there's participation, right? Like if there's not participation, then that channel of communication isn't really there, or it's very different. But just making it really clear that, we're working towards a goal of X. There are no promises of a cover story. There are no promises of a publication date. We're just working and doing our jobs to build the best framework for a story possible and then it's up to the editors to decide, above my pay grade, what is a great story and where it should be placed and when.
Definitely always throw your editor under the bus.
Yes.
Are we out of time? Do we have time for
A couple more questions and then we can wrap it up.
just want to throw it open to the floor for one more question. Anybody? Steve, let's hear it.
Just on the degrees of communication and how you engage, and we talked about there being no comment, as Prim says, no comment. That may be on the record, but they actually spoke quite a bit in the back. So I was just wondering for the folks in the room who may not be mixing it up with press, if you could just kind of go through on the record, off the record, on background, and how much of the information you glean is on background versus on the record.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, that is true. Like, just because a firm has been put down for no comment doesn't mean they haven't engaged. They just didn't want to have their conversation be quoted in the story. And so, I think probably a lot more happens on background than people would expect. And then sometimes, it is just a no comment, but yeah, I think that, there is, especially with high profile publications, like generally speaking, there is, people generally speaking will sort of speak on background and so on and so forth.
Yeah, there can be hours and hours of
On
conversation.
background. I mean, I love on background because that's
Could you
where.
just explain to the crowd like what that is versus
Okay.
off the record?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, on background means just what it says, right? And feel free to elucidate. I'm not always the best at explaining. Is that we're speaking on background. You're not going to be quoted. You're not going to be attributed in any way, shape, or form. But that background conversation can inform your overall reporting, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
No attribution, no names, but
Yeah.
we can use the material in the story.
And then off the record is just like purely informational, that you can't actually use the information. And then on the record, you've handed over, the keys to the kingdom.
And then again, just going back to trust really quickly, like the background conversations are where I feel like a lot of trust is earned. That's the proving ground for trust building exercise.
That being said, like sometimes, like you can't just expect, like to always be on background, especially, for certain types of stories. Like, so it's not this like get out of jail free card that people can just sort of use. At some point, even after you use background, sometimes or most of the time, you still have to address like the core claim or the core point of whatever the media is reaching out to, and so it can help sometimes contextualize things, but it doesn't also mean that eventually your firm has to speak for itself in some form or another.
And then there's always the reached out but didn't respond in time for publication.
Which is
Which is
Well,
fairly
that's the-
clear.
yeah.
Yeah. I'll give the last question to Carolyn, my former colleague in journalism.
So having been around financial journalism and public relations for a long time, I'm interested to hear all of the journalists, well, and you as well, in terms of perspective on like the comms that get in between like you and the facts, or how do you view PR? Because when I came up as a journalist with Steve, we were told like never talk to PR people. They're stupid. They don't know anything. They're just gonna say like, forget about it. Like do not engage. If you get a press release, like throw it in the garbage can. So, which was great training as a reporter because you had to learn how to actually find your own stories. But now I mean, a lot of things have changed, and a lot of things have changed since even I was in reporting. But how do you all view the comms function, and like, what's your advice for private equity or venture capital or hedge funds in terms of using comms? And is it just super annoying, or is it like sometimes helpful, or do you have recommendations about
Carolyn, could you just tell the audience what your role is right now?
that? I'm Ed Rubenstein. I'm a former reporter, and I'm also a member of the New York Financial Writers Association. So I see things from both sides of the fence. So
That context helps.
I can start with this one, and I'll try to keep it brief. But I do think things have changed a lot, and as we've discussed, as firms have gotten bigger and realized they can't hide, they've hired their own PR pros. A lot of times when you call, if you have a personal relationship with an executive that you are covering, like, you should always call them first. It just goes without saying. But you might have a good relationship with their PR representative too, and you could just say, hey, heads up, I just called, because we're really trying to reach him about this urgent story. Can you please get him on the phone as soon as you can? Other times, the person might not, the executive that you call will not call you back, and they'll immediately divert you to their PR contact anyway, so you're going to end up speaking with them. So I try to, I don't think it's a situation where, we should view it as a combative relationship. A lot of the PR folks have worked with particular clients for years and years and years, and so they know them, really well, possibly better than some of the internal folks. So, so I think it's important for journalists to, try to maintain and keep good relationships. But of course, we wouldn't be doing our jobs if we only talked to them.
Yeah, I basically second that.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think it runs the full gamut. I mean, there's some relationships where you find out like who the PR person is, and you're like, I'm going to call that guy directly. Other ones, that's a good first stop, and it's a good 1-2 punch. And then sometimes, like, there are situations where sometimes the organization might want, for example, like at a TV network, every day you could try to want to reach one or the other billionaire who would only do an interview once a year if you're lucky, or if that, but you just need to like dot your I's and cross your T's, and like just as a first stop, there are some times where you can get the information or get the resolution and have a very it becomes a very organically much better relationship when you have access to the principal on occasion and have a separate type of relationship and can work with the PR firm. But I mean, yeah, runs the whole gamut, just like it does with reporters that you guys have worked with, right? It depends on it's very personal and individual with firm and person and how you connect, and sometimes you get off on the wrong foot, and sometimes you get on too good of a foot, and then you have to reel it back when the story's not as fun. And
well, the other point also is like the media also, like the job description is to like naturally be skeptical. So a company can put out, like Carolyn said, they can put out a press release that says, our record results or whatever, but it's still incumbent on you, the journalist, to actually affirm that information and not just be this, sort of, dumb conveyor of other people's information.
Yeah, I think I would just say, I would echo all of that and say that, I think PR professionals are quite savvy now, recognizing that they can't just be automatons that are spitting out, press releases that go to PR Newswire and, end of day. And I also think, that the PR professionals really facilitate relationships. But Amanda, to your point, if you as a company or a firm are just, shepherding people directly to the PR, that's not a good way to continue to build the relationships.
Okay, well, thank you all for your time and your expertise and your excellent questions. It's been a really great discussion, so we'll wrap it up there. Thank you.
So.